Transforming with you is what it says on the cover of the Singtel annual report, and the transformation started 4 years ago continues. In the next 10 minutes, we'll look at how that transformation is taking shape, what businesses they're acquiring, how their existing acquisitions are performing, as well as what some of the other issues are that you need to know about before you head to the annual general meeting. Now, thank you for watching this video, but don't leave it at that. Make sure that you read the annual report for yourself before you head to Suntec City Convention Centre later in July. The chairman, Simon Israel, talks about just how important this transformation is for Singtel. He points out that the same motivations that set us on this path at the outset are as strong, if not stronger today. The consumer's needs continue to evolve, and Chua So-kung in her statement also refers to that when she lists some of the services that they have launched in the last year. For example, standalone data plans, a 10 gigabit per second data connection. If you're a particularly heavy mobile data user, maybe you watch a lot of videos, you want a more seamless experience, 10 gigabits per second, that does seem very fast indeed. And also a zero-rated music streaming service. Content-wise, they've also made some moves, licensing English Premier League, Cricket Australia and Netflix. In Australia, this has had a very positive impact, they say, helping Optus to retain and win more subscribers. The commentary is less gushing in Singapore, where they say that the strategy has mitigated declines in voice and those pricing pressures, suggesting that they are still facing some declines, notwithstanding this content strategy. Let's turn to page 1, where you see all of these colorful charts, just to get a pulse check on how the business is performing. And one thing that you'll hear again and again as I go through these charts is currency translation. Ready? Here we go. This is the revenue number, down 2%, largely because the Australian dollar weakened by 9% during the year. Other parts of the business are actually doing really well. Singapore's revenue is at a record. The group enterprise business revenue was up 13%, partly because of higher G-Cloud adoption by the Singapore government. And the 8.8% fall in equipment sales and 8.9% fall in IDD calls, because people are using WhatsApp and other messengers these days rather than making IDD calls, all of those things weren't enough to offset Singapore and its record numbers. So all up, it was currencies which dampened the party, and therefore a 2% decline in revenue. Turn to page 2, and you'll see some bright spots though. Firstly, let's look at those 3 round charts at the top there. You can see that Singapore now makes up just under 3 in $10 earned. So the regional associates, look at that big bubble. Almost half of their earnings come from those regional associates. 605 million mobile subscribers in 25 countries, up 9%, 49 million subscribers compared to a year ago. So you can see that transformation as far as the regionalization is concerned, contributing very strongly. But back to those currency translations, because you can see net profit here was up 2%, but when on a constant currency basis, when you assume that the Australian dollar and other regional currencies didn't move, net profit would have been actually 6%. The same for the underlying net profit, which strips out abnormals, up 1%, constant currency basis, up 4%. Currencies makes a big difference, and they don't really apologize for that. In the annual report, you read that, hey, we've had to diversify, we had to broaden our horizons beyond our small home market of Singapore. Currency translations are just a fact of life. When you look at the dividend, that was stable, but you also find on page 2 this chart, which shows the sheer cash amount that they have paid out. I'm going to ignore the special dividends in red just for the minute and focus on the blue bars, which show that for the last couple of years, every 2 years, they have increased the total cash sum that they have paid out to shareholders. We had 2.5 billion in 2011 and 2012, 2.7 billion paid out in 2013 and 2014, and now 2.8 billion in 2015 and 2016. Naturally, the question that shareholders will ask is that pool going to increase for the next 2 years? Total payout was 73% of profit at the top end of their range. Their debt increased by 1.1 billion, which is about 22% increase in debt, which is about the same amount as their interim dividend. Their total debt at page 111 Now at 9.1 billion, up from 8 billion a year ago. Their gearing has increased from just above 24% to just below 27%. So another question you might like to ask is, where do they see their debt picture, their debt profile going? Cash flow was down 23%. This is the free cash flow number, which is the number which shows the amount of money that they had left over after they paid their staff, paid their suppliers, and whatever other overheads they had. It's the money that they've got left over after they've reinvested in the business as well. In Singapore and Australia, both of the free cash flow numbers were down, even though CapEx was also lower. If you're very interested in the cash flow statement, go to page 109. That's where you see it laid out very, very clearly indeed, showing operating cash flow down 20%, partly because they kept paying their vendors higher vendor payments. Acquiring and retaining mobile customers in Australia still requires a bit of marketing expense. And lastly, they also had the $280 million payment for rolling out the fiber optic network in Singapore. And that was obviously absent this time, which is why we saw a fall in operating cash flow. Investing cash flow was also down, even though they continue to invest in their network. They paid more than $200 million for a rights issue on Bharti Telecom. They received a $500 million loan back from Netlink Trust, and they spent just over $1 billion on Trustwave, a Chicago-based company, which I'll come back to in a few moments. Financing cash flow, as I mentioned, $2.8 billion paid out in dividends during the year. They increased borrowings by $1.1 billion, and they paid out more interest, $336 million to be precise. Now on to Trustwave, which was a very interesting acquisition when it was first announced in April. It closed in September, and in the meantime, quite a number of things seem to have changed in the 14 or 15 months or so since they took that, or since they announced the acquisition. A couple of very interesting numbers that I picked out. They say that the acquisition of Trustwave in September brings with it a global customer base that they intend to build on and expand. What's interesting is that that expansion seemingly has already taken place to some extent. In the annual report, they say they have 12 operation centers. When they first announced it, they only had 5, with another 9 engineering centers. Seemingly, there's been some movement. And also at the time of the purchase, they said that they had 1,200 staff. In the annual report, they say they have 1,800. So it looks like they've hired more people as well. The acquisition cost is interesting because at just over $1 billion, the revenue at $147 million is a fairly sizable amount. But the company is actually still making losses, including amortization of intangibles and financing costs. That loss was $27 million. So $1 billion spent for $147 million in revenue and actually contributing a loss. An obvious question to management would be whether they are on track with their statement in April of 2015 that this business will be earnings accretive in the next year or so. I'll come back to Trustwave from an accounting perspective too in just a little while. But first, let's take a look at how else Singtel has been transforming. And I've already mentioned that they've acquired a number of new businesses. You'll be familiar with these names if you're a shareholder or you've been following Singtel. Amobi, strong growth. Hook, which is their over-the-top content joint venture with Sony Pictures Television and Warner Brothers. They've added subscribers in the most populous countries around the region. And DataSpark, which is their advanced analytics startup, scoring more contracts from both public and private sector companies, but no numbers provided. All up, these businesses, the Group Digital Life business, has increased revenue by 45%, but at $454 million, that's still a small percentage compared to the $16 billion that they make in group revenue, or made in the financial year under review. So still a very strongly growing part of the business, but still very small, and it's still making losses. Losses on an EBITDA basis down 24%, but at $137 million, read page 104, 105 if you want to look at it yourself, still not contributing to the bottom line. And as they say themselves, it'll be some time before all these businesses can ramp up to a global scale and contribute meaningfully to the bottom line. On the divestment front, we also get a little bit more news in the annual report. Nothing concrete in terms of a timeline, but they are looking to divest a majority stake in Netlink Trust, the fiber optic network company that they founded a few years ago in order to roll out the fiber optic network. They're committed to the Infocom Development Authority of Singapore to divest that down to less than 25%. by the 22nd of April 2018, to be precise. How are they going to do it? Well, if you look online, there's talk about an IPO worth more than $2 billion. According to Dow Jones, they've already started conversations with investment bankers, very early stage. Nothing further to be said in the annual report, except to say that they are likely to divest that down to less than 25% by the due date. Meantime, the business is contributing $39 million in profit, swinging around from a $14 million loss last year, revenue up by 18%. Okay, now let's take a look at the Australian fibre optic network, which is actually much more problematic than the one in Singapore. The national the national broadband network in Australia is something of a political hot potato. You just need to go online and you'll see all the stories, and that's not likely to improve in the short term. Page 87, among the risk factors, management says that with the deployment of the Australian NBN, competition is expected to increase as new operators enter the market, and perhaps even worse is the fact that it is possible that the Australian government's regulatory reforms could ultimately result in a suboptimal or negative outcome for Singtel's 100% wholly owned unit, Optus. Page 86-87, as I mentioned. So something else to keep your eye on. Here's a little bit more information on page 122, where you see the auditor report on key audit matters. This is to give shareholders the insight into what the auditor actually looked at and what they paid particular attention to when they were doing the audit on Singtel's books. The auditors will want to make sure that when Singtel says it collects revenue, that it actually does so. And obvious as that sounds, there were three particular areas that they paid close attention to. The first is long-term contracts. Second, the timing of revenue recognition. And I also found very interesting the auditor's commentary on whether the billing system is up to scratch. In essence, whenever Singtel changes the tariffs, changes how much it charges consumers, the billing system has to keep up. They can't just say we're going to charge you more, the billing system actually then has to charge more. So the auditor checked the software and actually did some samples and found again, clean bill of health. But interesting that the auditor would look at it in such great detail. Just a couple of other small snippets before we wrap it up. The first is directors' fees, which I know is always of interest to retail investors. Page 69 for further details. They're asking for $2.95 million in directors' fees, same amount as last year. Curiously, they only spent $2.4 million last year, so they actually came in well within budget. And also, what you see on page 74 is the top executives' pay. Frequently, when I review annual reports for you, the annual report says something along the lines of, we can't tell you what the executive pay number is because we're scared that other companies, competitors, will come and poach our executives. Well, no such fear at Singtel, it seems, because all of the key executives' pay is spelt out down to the last dollar. One last piece of news that you might like to ask about at the AGM is Singtel's consortium to turbocharge the electronic road pricing scheme here in Singapore, our toll road system. Currently, as you know, if you drive, there is an in-vehicle unit and a cash card through which your usage of roads is then deducted in dollars and cents. In the future, in Singapore, we will have one that is operated through satellite tracking and Singtel's 4G network. Singtel leads the consortium, and it's something that you might like to ask about how that's going as this is planned to be rolled out in years to come. The annual general meeting for Singtel is on the 29th of July at 3 p.m. at Suntec Singapore Convention Centre. Make sure once again that you read the annual report before you go.